Story 1. Outside of the United States, there were some horrible violent conflicts, namely the Kosovo War and the Rwandan genocide. Story 2. The height of the acquired immune deficiency syndrome epidemic was in the early 1990s. In 1992, it was the leading cause of death among men aged 25 to 44. These were very dark times that often do not get discussed because of the unjust stigma surrounding the disease. Story 3. If you missed the airing of a new episode of your television show, you were out of luck. You would have to wait until they ran reruns months or years later, or hope someone you knew had recorded it. Story 4. Crime. The 1990s were the decade when crime was truly an epidemic in the United States. That is not to say there is no crime today. There obviously is, but crime was a massive problem in almost every city in the United States with a substantial population, especially gang-related crime. It was not until the late 1990s that crime began to decline, and the trend continued into the 21st century before an uptick around 2020, which still did not rival levels experienced in the mid-1990s. It is easy to glamorize the decade and how prosperous it felt, but there was a real struggle for many American inner-city communities. Story 5. Having to rely on coal-fired steamships and locomotives to get around. Wait, which 1990s? Story 6. Well, the internet was still in its infancy. Many of us were chomping at the bit for it to expand in features and opportunities. Story 7. Rampant homophobia was deeply ingrained. It was common for television personalities and comedians to make jokes whose only punchline was that someone was gay, which was an insult. Story 8. There was a fad when everything was extreme. It was everywhere, especially in marketing targeted at teen boys. Story 9. If you missed an episode of a show, you were out of luck. You could plan your life around one show's schedule, but if a storm rolled through on Thursday night and knocked out the power for an hour or two, you might miss Carter and Lucy being stabbed on Emergency Room, and the next week you would be left trying to piece the story together. There was no way to catch that episode again unless you happened to see it in reruns during the off-season. What was worse is that when those reruns aired, they often ran in no particular order, so you had to read the television guide each week just to figure out when the episode would be on. Story 10. Is this the beginning of We Didn't Start the Fire Part 2? I see what you are doing, Billy Joel. Story 11. Bill Clinton remade the Democratic Party from New Dealers into conservative neoliberals. The Democratic Party's elected leadership has, for the most part, still not broken from this Reagan-influenced ideology. Story 12. Managing your bank account and checkbook was a pain in the ass, but it let you write checks a couple of days before you were paid, since they took a while to clear. It was like your own little payday loan. Almost everything else was better in the 1990s. Looking up information in a library had no ads. Movie theater listings were simple. People had pensions and watched the same television shows at the same time. There was no social media. Dating, healthcare access, and access to higher quality food were easier. Entertainment was cheaper. People met in person instead of yelling at each other on screens. Network news had less filler, and journalism was a career. Theme parks had fewer tiers and less exclusive access for very important people. Abortion was more accessible. School and housing were cheaper. Yes, your television was smaller, but it lasted longer and did not need to boot up when you turned it on. There were fewer channels and fewer video games, so we read books. I can say objectively that almost everything has gotten worse except the price of consumer electronics, which led to a massive amount of electronic waste. Therefore, I would not call the past 30 years much of progress. Story 13. The Fall of Yugoslavia. Rwandan genocide. Ruby Ridge standoff, Waco siege, Oklahoma City bombing, Columbine shooting, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and the associated rise in homophobia. The 1990s were definitely a prosperous time, but the fall of the Iron Curtain turned the spotlight onto domestic issues. It was not all peaches and cream. Story 14. Besides homophobia, people with mental illnesses and conditions were made fun of. Diagnoses such as autism and Asperger's weren't widely recognized, and if a child displayed those symptoms, they were labeled as weird or given other derogatory names and pushed aside. Story 15. The number of fads grew. This is not to say they were all bad, but the market became oversaturated. Everyone wanted to create the next best thing, and it became too much. Story 16, rewinding your tapes. We will never get that time back. Story 17, talk shows run from 8 in the morning until 8 at night nonstop, featuring the most inane topics and low-quality guests. They can be funny, though. Story 18, it marked the end of the age of innocence for schools and gun violence. After Columbine, every generation of children has had to live with the possibility that they could one day be shot simply for attending school. Story 19, the 1990s were great. I would walk half a mile to use a payphone. Story 20, as a university student, my friends and I each regularly paid $300 to $400 a month for long-distance phone calls, essentially doubling our rent. Story 21, in the early 1990s, some bands tried to redefine themselves because of grunge. Much of that was not pretty. Story 22, arcades were already on the decline by then. By 1996, my mall arcade had curtained off the back half of the space. Story 23, the decade began with a lot of hype, but that changed before it really happened. The recession changed the mood and depressed everyone. The Gulf War and Operation Desert Shield occurred. Generation X had a very cynical and pessimistic outlook compared to the 1980s, when they were more happy and optimistic. Many people said, "The 1990s came and I lost everything." Anti-gay people mockingly called the 1990s the gay 90s, because many television shows and movies in the 1990s included at least one token gay character, especially between 1995 and 1999. Racial hostility resurfaced after having cooled off in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. The media often portrayed black people as street thugs who spoke Ebonics in television shows. Jaleel White spoke about how he was treated in real life as Steve Urkel on Family Matters and how he did not fit the black stereotype of the time. There were also jokes that Hillary Banks and Carlton were too white because they were not black enough, and jokes about Will Smith that reinforced negative stereotypes about black people, which was harmful. Jaleel White faced particularly harsh treatment in real life. High rates of antidepressant use among Americans were a problem. Prozac was prescribed widely as a so-called wonder drug. Warnings about Osama bin Laden were ignored multiple times throughout the 1990s. Products began to be made cheaper than in the 1970s and 1980s, which lowered prices for items such as videocassette recorders, computers, and blank tapes, but the quality declined. Ironically, many recordings from the 1980s hold up better than recordings from the 1990s. Old commercials from the 1980s often have better detail, sharper color contrast, and clearer audio. Recordings from the 1990s are often softer, with blurrier or more artificial color contrast. Many 1990s recordings were made with the audio level set too low, resulting in tape hiss or metallic ringing. I noticed this at the time even though I had top-of-the-line videocassette recorders and Super VHS recorders. They were still not as good as my two-head videocassette recorder from 1985 and earlier models. Blank tapes were made flimsier and cheaper. In the 1980s, cable boxes still used the television's default audio volume, but in the 1990s the volume was controlled only through the cable box, so the audio level used when recording videotapes or digital versatile discs affected the final recording. This began to be fixed with digital cable by 1999, but by then many recordings had already been ruined. The internet was still very slow in the 1990s. Internet video was low quality even in the late 1990s. Downloading a single MPEG audio layer 3 file could take from 45 minutes to several hours or even days in the late 1990s. That is all I can think of at the moment. Story 24. Nothing. The internet speeds were terrible. You did not know what it was going to be. The last era of genuine ignorance. Story 25. Looking back, we treated Monica Lewinsky terribly. We should have stood up for her and vilified Clinton. Story 26. Disk operating system was amusing and manual. I remember it well, but when I started using Windows, I felt as though I had been tortured. Story 27. That is not the worst thing, given the genocides which I am sure have been mentioned. I was going to say the heroin chic era. Body image has never recovered. Story 28. Watching my favorite baseball team lose 4 World Series was painful. Braves fans' agony was only exceeded by that of Bills fans. At least we got to see the mountaintop once. Story 29. A lack of health knowledge and consideration. A lack of smartphones. The economy felt much better and people had access to better retirement. The flavor of the 1990s was amazing. There was great music, movies, video games, and outdoor activities. Where I lived, new commerce was being built, but there was still a lot of open space because the area was just beginning to grow. If I could time travel with no repercussions, I would bring my family back to the 1980s and 1990s. Story 30. Parents were so disengaged that their parenting became emotionally neglectful. Many of us were latchkey kids from a young age, with both parents working long hours. There seemed to be a culture of parents placing their own needs and wants first, so even after the workday ended they often focused on personal activities such as going to the gym, choir, book club, gaming, and so on. The intensive parenting that millennials now practice is a massive overcorrection, but I understand why many parents adopted it. Story 31. Violence. There were not many security cameras or deoxyribonucleic acid evidence in those days. Story 32. The bombardment of news about Rodney King, the riots, O.J. Simpson, President Bill Clinton, and the Gulf War. Going to work in a shirt and tie. The Microsoft antitrust case. Story 33. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was a huge epidemic, and we did not have the medications we have today. Millions of people died before governments took it seriously because it was dismissed as gay cancer. Crime rates were much higher. There were no resources like YouTube for tutorials on cooking or changing a tire. If you did not have parents to teach and guide you, you were on your own. It was considered cool to be stupid in high school. Nerds were mercilessly teased and bullied for being smart and working hard. Some of that still happens today, but it is more acceptable now to be nerdy and knowledgeable about how the world works. Story 34. They ended it and then we got George W. Bush and a never-ending war. Story 35. It really depends on where you were. In Japan, the economic crash that marked the end of the bubble era and the 1995 terrorist attacks by Aum Shinrikyo occurred. Story 36. Care for people with diabetes was even more alarmingly primitive than it is today. Story 37. My mother died of cancer, and today is the anniversary of her death. Story 38. The 1990s were great, but the worst part was losing the craziness of the 1980s. Story 39. When we first got the internet, it was ridiculously slow. Story 40. Being young was the best thing. Then blowjobs. Story 41. Having to use a payphone. Cell phone plans. Technology was limited. Long-distance service. Dial-up. Slow internet. Computers did not do as much. Cell phones could only make calls. Nothing else. No moving picture experts group audio layer 3 files. There was cigarette smoke everywhere. Signing up for college courses by phone using touchtone dialing. Story 42. The oversexualization of everything was common. Back then people even sexualized children. Britney Spears was about 16, I think, when Baby One More Time came out. Story 43. Acquired immune deficiency syndrome, multiple attempts at genocide around the world, government-fueled racial tensions, and cross colors. If you know, you know. Story 44. Well, I'm a man, but for women the era of no means yes was still lingering somewhat. The Me Too movement was actually quite a big deal. Story 45. Serious answer. Rwandan genocide. Unserious answer. If you missed an episode of a television show or a television special, you had to accept that it might be gone forever. It was not as if the internet thing you saw on television would take off, and even if it did, people would not invent a way to watch nearly any show ever made. Story 46. Breathing secondhand smoke at bars and concerts feels like it sticks to your clothes. Story 47. Bad sharing was still very prevalent. For every Supra there were 3 identical Pebbles from Chrysler with different grills. Story 48. Probably not Serbia or Bosnia. They were not having a good time over there. Story 49. Block parent program. They forgot to do background checks. Review: everyone approved as a block parent. Too many individuals with sexual offense convictions signed up for the door-to-door service and were approved. Story 50. There was an obsession with being skinny to the point of being emaciated. The 1990s were really rough on women. Story 51. I had to get off the internet to use the phone, and I had to get off the phone to use the internet. Story 52. If you had interests even slightly off from the mainstream, you were considered weird and told to get a life. Story 53. False sense of hope that the world was not going to burn. The Cold War was over. Peace seemed to be breaking out in a lot of places that made the news. Story 54. Rampant homophobia. Anything you did was called gay and made you a fag. People became somewhat more accepting. They were less violent and instead bullied people rather than trying to maim them. But then everyone was saying things like that constantly. Story 55. The quick switch from energetic, testosterone-filled hairbands to the Smashing Pumpkins. Story 56. Cars used to be significantly more dangerous. You rarely hear about people dying in car accidents these days. Story 57. The awful font used by Entertainment and Sports Programming Network 2 when it first launched. Story 58. Homophobia, sexism, and racism. There were major riots in the United States due to the beating of Rodney King. We experienced one of the worst mass shootings in Australia, which led to the outlawing of semi-automatic firearms and the introduction of common-sense gun laws. Internet speeds were poor as well. Story 59. Desert Storm kicked off a new era of American imperialism in the Middle East. Story 60. Everyone pretending that acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was not destroying gay communities is the only answer. Story 61. The Criminal Justice Act is restricting your freedom to party anywhere all night. Before that, no one really cared what you did at night. There has also been a mass rollout of closed-circuit television surveillance across the United Kingdom. Story 62. I'll tell you what was better in the 1990s and flip this on its head. Cliffhangers in television shows. Nothing shocks us anymore. We are all fried. Story 63. Strangely enough, I just started watching a series called Dark Side of the 1990s yesterday. It is pretty interesting. I do not remember Beanie Babies at all. One of the actresses from Beverly Hills 90210 said she was not supposed to hug a black actor, the dancing guy from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, because Middle America supposedly would not want that. She kissed and hugged him. Shows in the 1990s were pushing boundaries more than those in the 1980s, I guess. Thinking further back to Archie Bunker and George Jefferson, that seemed more progressive than a lot of television since. Story 64. There was little to no access to anti-HIV drugs. Some infected people sold their life insurance policies to third-party companies for pennies on the dollar, either to afford the medications or because they did not think they had much longer to live. Story 65. Single mothers were still vilified, but dating and casual sex were accepted. Single fathers? What consequences? The mother should have ensured this did not happen to inconvenience him. Story 66. Having to stop and ask the gas station attendant for directions. Story 67. Depending on where you live, you could be in an active war zone, subject to genocide, or watching your nation collapse. Story 68. Sorry, I can't assist with content that sexualizes minors. Here's a sanitized alternative suitable for Azure text-to-speech. A cornucopia of content, but at dial-up speed, made the early internet experience both exciting and frustrating. Story 69. A diagnosis of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome was still considered a death sentence. Heroin use was also widespread during that period. Story 70. It was really difficult to get hold of nude photos if you were under 18. When I heard my governor was blocking porn sites for minors, I thought, good. Enforce it, you little perverts. Story 71. The dial-up sound was iconic and grating. Story 72. It depends on the country. In Russia specifically, crime and corruption were widespread. The period was called the Wild 1990s because violent mob wars and people killing each other over ownership of a small bread kiosk were the norm. Story 73. Average unemployment was 5.6%, and mortgage rates were as high as 9.9%. Violent crime was historically high. Discrimination was much worse than it is now, and bullying and demonizing were also worse. Many metrics were worse in the 1990s than they are now. Story 74. The Rwandan genocide and the many genocides that followed were so horrible, but people do not often talk about them. Story 75. Creepy pornographic magazines were hidden in the woods. Men hid them in secluded places for people to find. The magazines had been used and were disturbing. Many boys in the 1990s found such magazines in the woods. Story 76. The ethnic cleansing in Bosnia is burned into my mind. My mother sobbing on the couch while it played on the news. Story 77. How common it was for 14 or 15-year-old schoolgirls to be dating a man in his early 20s, and how much more accepted it seemed to be in society. Story 78. There were still smoking sections, and although a section might contain only 5 tables, cigarette smoke was noticeable as soon as you entered a restaurant. My father's blue-collar job was our family's only income, so when the recession hit, it was extremely difficult for several years to pay for necessities. Story 79. The music. For some reason, during the most peaceful time in history, people decided music should no longer be fun and that everything had to be so serious with baritones and flannel. Story 80. The idea that beauty meant stick-thin women with very long legs and perfectly flat stomachs. Story 81. I feel bullying was a lot worse back then. Kids these days are much kinder to each other than I remember from when I was growing up. Story 82. Notwithstanding recent election results, mainstream culture in the 1990s was more conservative than the present day in many ways. Racism and homophobia were widespread in popular discourse, jokes, and so on. Story 83. Cars were generally poor. They had mediocre reliability, were easy to steal, had bland designs, often quite loud engines, SOSO safety features, and limited equipment options. Many still ran on leaded fuel, had poor fuel consumption, and you used to see rainbow-colored puddles on the ground from leaked fuel or oil. I have not seen that for about 25 years. With very few exceptions, they were not as high-performing or as powerful as modern cars. Even a Ferrari from that era was never as quick as a modern one. If you went to any major car park during a busy time, you would see several relatively new cars that would not start, with people poking around the engine bays. That was normal. Story 84. The value menus are gone. I vividly remember one night when 2 of my buddies came over and said they had spent $12 at Taco Bell. We were like, who the fuck spends that much? Tacos were 49 cents each then, and if you were really broke, Del Taco had 39 cents tacos. I also know for a fact that with the high school discount we got at McDonald's by showing our identification cards, the 2 cheeseburger meals were only $2.19 with tax. The key was leaving campus early and driving there before the line got long, so you had time to smoke before returning to school. And speaking of smoking, a pack of cigarettes and a 32-ounce soda was only $2 at the drive-through liquor store, where, as long as you drove through in a car, they would not ask for identification to buy cigarettes. Story 85. Cigarettes were still everywhere. Thankfully, they're almost completely banned now. Story 86. The one-hit wonder rhythm and blues groups with colorful outfits and the song I Have to Beg Her. Story 87. Smoking occurred indoors everywhere. It was common in restaurants and malls. We even had no smoking sections in restaurants, as if that made a difference. Story 88. Satanic panic started in the 1980s but was widely in effect in the 1990s. The grand old party contract with America marked the real beginning of Republican dirty tricks under Newt Gingrich. The Rwandan genocide saw people in the United States making jokes about it and refusing to take action. See also Serbian genocidal attacks on Croats and Bosnians. The police beating of Rodney King and the subsequent acquittal led to riots. Rampant homophobia led people to claim gay panic as a defense for beating or murdering someone. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.